G'day, I'm Warwick Schiller and welcome back to the Principles of Training. Today we're going to be talking about the principle that I call anticipation is your best friend or your worst enemy. So at clinics around the world I often have people say to me, my horse anticipates, what should I do about that? And I say, well, that's really good, because everything your horse learns good's through anticipation and everything he learns bad's through anticipation. So the title of this principle is called Anticipation is your best friend or your worst enemy. And anticipation depends on how you use it. A lot of people, they let anticipation use them, but really good horse trainers use anticipation to their advantage. So in the last episode, talking about the application of aids, I talked about how you would teach a horse to be responsive to an aid. And when you apply an aid, the response to that aid right there, so right then when I want him to go faster, I just pointed. When you apply an aid, the response to that aid is taught. You're going to do one thing, you know, if we talked about what I do, I'll ask a horse to go, take the slack out of the rope, ask them to go, I might step towards them, and then I might wave the flag, and when they go, I will release all of those cues. Okay, so there's the first, let's put numbers to them. There's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and the horse goes. And after a while, you do number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and the horse goes. And after a while, you do number 1, number 2, number 3, and the horse goes. And you get down to where the horse goes off number 1. Well, I talked in that previous episode about how that's how horses teach each other things. And they will do number 1, which will be make a face. Number 2, which is pin their ears. Number 3, which is running them with their teeth bared. Number 4 might be biting. Number 5, they might have to kick. But eventually they don't have to do number 5. They don't have to do number 4, they don't have to do number 3 or number 2, they only have to do number 1. Okay, so that, you're teaching them some anticipation there. Okay, but where people run into problems with anticipation is, let's do another scenario of 5 things in a row, starting out by something subtle, ended up in a kick. Okay, think about this. People go to get on their horse, they put their foot in the stirrup. Number 1, bounce up and down. Number 2, swing up and land in the saddle. Number 3, reach for their right stirrup. Number 4, and then kick till the horse goes forward. Number 5. If you repeat that over and over and over, after a while you'll do number 1, put your foot in the stirrup. Number 2, bounce up and down. Number 3, land in the saddle. Number 4, go to reach for your stirrup, and the horse will walk off. And if you keep going with them right then, you'll find that you'll do number 1, number 2, number 3, and as your bum lands in the saddle, they'll walk off. And then eventually you'll do number 1, number 2, and your horse is walking off. And then eventually you just do number 1, you put your foot in the stirrup, the horse walks off, and you go, my horse, he's a bad horse, he walks off when I go to get on. But many times that's teaching anticipation in a place you don't want to teach anticipation. So what you would do is break it up. You can do the first 4 in a row, because the first 4 aren't an aversive, they're not putting pressure on that horse. So you can do, put your foot in the stirrup, bounce up and down, hop on, get your stirrup, wait 20 seconds, and then if you ask them to go off, you're not developing anticipation, because you put a gap between the things that you do and the aversive, the thing that actually makes it happen. So the basic rules for anticipation are, if you want your horse to anticipate something, you're going to do it the same way every time. If you don't want him to anticipate something, you're going to do it different every time. A very good example of this was in a previous episode called Do the Opposite. And if you remember with the jumping horse, when it went across a diagonal line and was going to go around a corner, okay, if every time it goes over that last jump, you go around that corner to the left, pretty soon you go over that last jump and that horse is leaning in and you're trying to hold its shoulder up. So what did we do in that situation? We did the opposite, but doing the opposite, so breaking things up and not having them be the same way every time is a way to prevent anticipation. So I'm back here in Arizona with my friend Tamara Barrett and her hunter jumpers, and we were just talking about how a diagonal line like this in a jumping course heading towards a corner like that, when a horse comes down this line and goes over there, where are they going to go next every time in a competition?
They're always going to turn left.
They're always going to turn left. So because you do the same thing over and over and over, what problem does that cause?
They start to anticipate that turn and get real heavy on your hand and dive in
Okay.
on the turn.
Okay, and that's a bad thing, isn't it?
It is.
But it's not a bad thing, really, if you think about it. The horse is anticipating. Anticipating is your best friend or your worst enemy. Now, if you know, I've talked about this a lot. If you want your horse to anticipate something, you do it repetitively. If you don't want them to anticipate it, you break it up. So we're about to show you, with our horse and rider here, an exercise that Tamara and all the other jumping trainers do to break up that pattern. And so to combat that anticipation of that horse going left down there every time like they do in competition, Tamara was telling me what they'll do is exactly that right there, is you'll have that horse go on that line and turn right. Now, how does the drill work? Do you turn right every time?
No, not every time.
So what do you do?
Well, you turn right until they start to think you're turning right, and then you turn to the left.
Okay, so you turn right till you start to build some anticipation that you can go right, and then you go the other way. And I imagine you do that till they start to build anticipation and then go the other way.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it all comes back to that, do the opposite, but it is also about anticipation being your best friend or your worst enemy, and depending on how you use it depends on what results you get. So think about, that's a jumping thing, but I'll give you a reining thing, okay? If you've ever seen a sliding stop with a reining horse, the reason those horses push so hard with their hind feet is anticipation. They're not actually trying to stop. They're actually anticipating backing up. And so the start of teaching the sliding stop is teaching those horses how to bend their hocks and bend their loin when they back up. That's the very, very, very beginning of it. That's what you start with. And eventually you have them back up really well from a standstill. And you'd like those horses to engage from front to back, their whole body get round when you back up. Then you'll do it from a walk and you'll do it from a trot. But every time you stop, you'll actually have your horse stop and back up. So the last thing they're going to do is back up, okay? And so if you think about it, after a while when you ask them to stop, they anticipate the fact that the next thing they're going to do is back up, and they start to get ready to back up. And so it's a way to get those horses to engage their hind end when you come to a stop. Does that make sense there? And so eventually when a reining horse runs down there and does a sliding stop, it's actually anticipation. He's anticipating the next thing you're going to ask him to do is back up, and he gets ready to back up when you say the word whoa while he's galloping. So part of the sliding stop in the reining, or what happens immediately after a sliding stop is the reining, is what's called a rollback. So the horse does a sliding stop, and then they have to do a 180-degree turn over their hocks and exit that rollback and lope off down the arena again. But a horse needs to stop really, really straight. So there's a lot of anticipation involved in that stop. But if they anticipate the rollback and they start to get crooked and think they're going to go the other way, your stop will not work, okay? It'll get in the way of your stop. So they have to really anticipate the fact they're going to back up when you stop, which means every time we stop, we want them to back up. But if every time we stopped, we immediately rolled back, the horse would start to anticipate that. So we don't always roll back. A lot of times if you're going to work on the rollback, after you stop, you'll sit there and wait quite a while and remove the rollback from the stop, make them completely separate maneuvers. Then you could roll back, but we don't really practice stopping and rolling back because they get anticipating it. But we do practice stopping and backing up because that's the anticipation we want. That's the good anticipation. That's going to add to our performance. Whereas the anticipation of rolling back would detract from our performance. So all of these principles of training are all interlaced and interlocked. And if you think about, say, teaching a horse collection and all the transitions you would do teaching collection, the principle we talked about, which was called do the opposite. Think about if you're doing a walk to trot transition and a trot to walk transition. Okay, you did a lot of those. When you go from a walk to a trot, if you got a trot that resembled a Western pleasure jog, you wouldn't then do a downward transition. You'd do the opposite of what you'd have. You'd go upward. If you went from a trot to a walk and your horse was doing this big old charge forward sort of walk, you might want to do another downward transition or actually a halt transition. Okay, so that's called do the opposite, and that would help build that, start to get that horse to think about getting collected, getting themselves ready. That's anticipation right there. A horse who, when you ask him to trot, is only trotting, he's on his front end, he is not actually anticipating, he's just trotting. Okay, he's not anticipating doing something else. So if you think about that do the opposite principle and the principle of anticipation, you really want those horses anticipating doing something else. And if you've ever seen someone teach, say, Piaffe or Passage, okay, you've got that big trot, little trot, big trot, little trot, and that horse is starting to anticipate doing a big trot and little trot at the same time, and that's where you get all that suspension. But it's all really anticipation of doing something other than what they're doing. Very, very similar to the way we get a reining horse to slide. It's very similar. The front end comes up, the hind end is really engaged, and those two principles I just talked about are very, very attached to, you know, teaching high-level dressage stuff, and also the reining horses stop. Another high-level maneuver where anticipation's your best friend or your worst enemy is the flying lead change. I always tell people that the second hardest part about teaching the flying lead change is teaching the flying lead change. The hardest part of teaching the flying lead change is, once you get them where they change leads good, is not having them anticipate it, because the flying lead change, it only works perfectly well if the horse is not anticipating changing leads. They've got to be square, they've got to be up, they've got to have their shoulders up, and they've got to be right here in the middle. And I think one of the things that almost everybody that does a really structured lead change does is set that horse up to change leads, prepare that horse to change leads. And in the reining world, we call it setting them up to change leads. The dressage people probably call it just a leg yield. But, you know, let's say you were, let's say we're going to change leads here, and you're going to come down the diagonal on a right lead. You're coming down this diagonal on a right lead. You probably put your left leg on the girth and change that flexion, just a little bit of your horse's body, to prepare for that lead change. And then you can do the flying lead change. But if you do that every time, come down there and you prepare that horse to change leads, change that flexion a little bit, or use that little leg yield right there, and you use that little leg yield, and then you add your other leg, okay, you push with your other leg, then they change lead, then you take both of them off. Pretty soon, that little leg yield right there is the precursor to the flying lead change. It's kind of like I talked about those horses in the last episode. The horse does, you know, something subtle and then something bigger till the other horse runs away. Pretty soon the subtle thing makes them go away. So if you did the leg yield, lead change, leg yield, yield change, leg yield, yield change, pretty soon you'd go to do that leg yield, that horse would think he was going to do the flying lead change next, which is why you do a lot of leg yields without the flying lead change, and it's why you would always separate those. There's one of the better reining trainers in the world, his name's Andrea Fappani, he's from Italy, lives here in America, and he says he sets a horse up 30 times for every one time he changes leads. And so in the reining, you do circles on one side, and then you'll change leads in the middle and you go the other way. We really make sure those horses do not anticipate that the lead change and the change of direction happen one after another. They're two completely different things. So a lot of times when we're changing leads or working on a lead change, we'll change leads from a regular canter to a counter canter, or a counter canter to a regular canter, usually a regular canter to a counter canter probably, but when we're really trying to stop the anticipation of those horses thinking that they're going to change leads and go the other way. And so, you know, most reining trainers do not do a lead change and a directional change at the same time, because we need to keep them separate from each other. And if you think of it in the reining, we don't have any contact on the reins for the most part when we're doing this, so we really can't hold things up. And, you know, once you get them to where they're not anticipating, you don't need to use your reins to hold them up. You could actually do a flying lead change in a straight line bridleless on a horse, because there is no need for that horse, there's no need for you to use your reins and hold the shoulder up that he's anticipating, because there is no anticipation there. So I really should be able to come down here, do a little bit of a leg yield like that, and then just change leads like that with no bridle on it. So teaching your horse to be really responsive is really a big part of it. You know, anticipation's a big part of that. You know, you might notice that when I'm sitting around in most of these videos, my hand that's holding the reins is on their neck. I don't pick that. For me, the start of my hand coming off their neck would be the start of that signal. If you think about the horses in the herd, when the one makes the ugly face and pins its ears, that's always the start of a signal to go. That is never something other than the start of a signal to go. And they'll do it and follow through every time. So, you know, if I'm sitting here and I start to take the slack out of the reins, you might notice right then, as I start to take the slack out of the reins, Bundy shifted his weight to his hind end. And then when I'm done, my hand goes back down. So if I ride around with my hands up here all the time and they're doing a lot of stuff all the time, then we can't have the anticipation going on. We can't tie that to something else. Now, of course, if they get too feely about your hands, you would have to disassociate them from that. But it's the same thing with steering. If I'm riding along and I want to steer, I'm going to take this hand and start to run it down that rein. And as it starts to go in, the sea starts to turn, I don't have to pull on the rein. And the reason I don't have to pull on the rein is because I don't ever touch that rein unless I'm wanting him to steer. Does that make sense there? I'm going to take my hand down that rein, and right now I've got to move my outside rein because I want to move his front feet. But I never do that unless I'm actually wanting something to happen. What I don't do is ride along and kind of do that. If I move my hand down this rein, it only means bend and go this way, okay? It doesn't ever mean don't go this way. And so that's, you know, anticipation's a huge part of this, but you got to be careful what you anticipate. It's the same thing with your leg aids. You know, I really want these horses to be responsive to my seat and leg aids. So if I ask him, I don't use my seat and leg when I don't want something to happen. And if I ask him to go and he doesn't go, so let's say I'm sitting here and I use my seat and my legs and he didn't go right then, I would follow through. I'd kind of bump him with my legs pretty firmly and say, hey, you got to go when I ask. Okay, I tend to have a bad habit of just annoying them with my legs just a little bit. It comes from years ago, and I still to this day try to work on getting rid of it. But so I have to be very aware of that. But how do you stop those horses from being dull on your leg is don't nag them, and you want them to, you want to have anticipation. You want to have you ask, follow through, they go, your leg comes off, and so that's a way you can get them to be responsive to your leg. So your responsiveness to your aids all has to do with anticipation, but you've got to be careful what you get those horses to anticipate. So there was a horse at a clinic in Canada last year, and trying to get this horse, off her seat and legs, the girl had some problems. She'd kind of kicked on him a little bit and he'd kind of bucked her off before. So she was kind of worried about doing it. And I said, well, I can get on it, I'll do it, because she'd been through all the previous exercises and I didn't see it in there, so I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. And so what I did was I had to hold this rein here and I held the horn, and then I used my seat, legs, kicked him pretty hard and he went, and I bent him around to a stop. Let him stop and then I let go, but I still held the horn. And then I did it again, and did it again, and did it again. I repeated it 5 or 6 times and he was starting to get better about it. And I also realized he wasn't going to buck me off. So then what I did was I let go of the horn and I had my hand on his neck and I squeezed out his leg and off we went. And then I reached down and I bent him around to a stop. I got rid of, think about the principle of don't go to bed angry. When you get him up, get him down. Getting this horse forward off our seat. I made sure that when I got him forward off my seat that I then got him relaxed again. But then what I did was I took my hand from here, held the horn, squeezed, kick, off we went. And we repeated that, 5 or 6 times, and he was getting really good, nice and forward. Okay, I'd even think about kicking and he'd shoot forward. But then I took my hand off his neck, I went to hold the horn, and he shot forward. And the reason being was because I did them in order. I did that, followed by seat, legs, kick, kick, and off he went. And so I was trying to get him to respond to this aid here, my seat and my legs, and initially there was no little aid at the start with my hand. It was here and it didn't change. When I went forward, bent him to a stop, sat there, it didn't change at all. But then when I started adding that, then my seat and legs, pretty soon I did that and off he shot. So horses can pick up things like that just so very easily, and that's what they call a pre-cue. Okay, it's a cue you add before the cue you add, and you've got to be careful with those pre-cues. So that thing I just showed you that horse learnt to do wrong, that's what we call a pre-cue. And a pre-cue is it's a subtle cue you'll add after you have taught a pre-existing cue. You've taught a cue, you've escalated it, and you've got that behavior working quite well. Then you can add a pre-cue in the front of it, which doesn't really seem like it's related. And if you think about what I did, I picked up on the reins as a pre-cue and then added leg. And so think about, if you always pick up on the reins before you add leg to go forward, pretty soon you're picking up on the reins could be a pre-cue to actually go forward. And so in and you don't want it that way. So in those two cases, the pre-cue would be a bad thing. In the case of Bundy here, I'm teaching him a trick. I'm teaching him to sit down like a dog. And what I'm doing is I take I've got a little piece of PVC pipe and I lay it against his leg, and I've taught him to bow down, then sit up like a dog. And when he sits up like that, that's the answer. So what I'm going to do eventually, once I get that perfected to where I put that stick on his leg and he just sits down like a dog and he does it perfectly well every time, then I'm going to add a pre-cue. Okay, I'm going to anticipate that. So I'm going to lay that pipe, what I'm going to do when I add the pre-cue, is I'm probably going to take my hat off, lay the pipe on his leg, he sits like a dog. Take my hat off, lay the pipe on his leg, sits like a dog. And after a while I should be able to go like this. It'd be a cool end to some of the videos, wouldn't it, if I tip my hat and Bundy sits down like a dog. But the thing with that is it's a pre-cue, and you're going to teach it after you've already taught an established behaviour. And so that would be a really huge case of anticipation. You anticipate that's connected to that. So anytime you're using anticipation, you've got to connect those two things together. So I hope that gives you an idea about anticipation, and don't forget to join us next time for another episode of The Principles of Training.